The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in the description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. The cottage had finished burning before Dumbledore arrived. Catastrophes, he had long observed, never waited for witnesses. They did what they came to do and left the wreckage for everyone else to make sense of. Tonight's wreckage was rubble, a gate on one hinge, and the particular silence of a village that hadn't yet realized it had been sleeping beside history. Dumbledore did not grieve. He had learned across a long life to schedule grief, to seal it in a specific compartment, and address it when the work was done. James was dead. Lily was dead. He absorbed these facts with the completeness of a man who had already run this scenario and knew what it cost. What he had not modeled precisely was the baby, 15 months old, green-eyed, alive in the wreckage of a destroyed crib with a composure no infant should have, looking up at Dumbledore with eyes already too old for the face they occupied. On his forehead, a wound in the shape of a lightning bolt, still livid, faintly crackling at its edges. The residue of a rebounded killing curse was unmistakable. Enormous, architectural in its scale, carrying the signature of magic turned back on itself with the full force of an ancient protective sacrifice. But beneath it, embedded in the tissue of the child's soul with the density of something placed rather than grown, was something else entirely, a fragment, a splinter of foreign consciousness. Dumbledore sat in the nursery rubble and thought, face still, internal calculation running at speed. The boy was both vessel and shard, Lily's sacrifice made permanent in his blood, and within that blood, a piece of the man who had technically just been destroyed. If Voldemort had built himself the architecture of immortality, and Dumbledore, uniquely, believed he had in fact spent the last 7 years quietly building a case that the Dark Lord had done precisely this, then this shard was a thread leading back to a needle still existing somewhere in the dark. And every surviving Death Eater would hunt the lightning bolt scar, would hunt Harry Potter. The most visible heir was the most endangered heir. He picked the boy up. He held him while the calculation resolved. It took 11 minutes. He timed it afterward, the way he timed everything that had gone irreversibly wrong, in case the number mattered later. The bloodmark ritual existed in a text he had found in the Founder's restricted archive at 31, and spent the subsequent decades hoping he would never need. It was not clean magic, not reversible. It occupied a category he would have told any student was the province of those who had abandoned ethics for utility, which was precisely why no one would suspect it of him. He had discovered, over 6 decades, that the best disguise for a transgression was the appearance of the man least likely to commit it. The house on Blythe Street in London had police tape across the door. He stepped through without touching it. The couple who had lived here, magical researchers both, whose theoretical work on bloodword mathematics he had corresponded with for 3 years, had died in a targeted attack bearing Bellatrix Lestrange's signature in every particular. The house was intact, simply emptied, not entirely. In a bedroom with pale green walls, a 13-month-old girl slept with the total commitment of early childhood, dark curly hair, small fists, the density of a child who hadn't yet learned what the world could do. A mobile of silver paper birds turned slowly above her crib, stirred by some draft only they could feel. Her name was in the registry, Hermione. Her parents had been precise about it, the kind of people who believed precision was its own form of respect for the thing being named. Dumbledore began the ritual. He had constructed it to carry more than the mark itself. The bloodmark transfer would also carry the anchor of Lily Potter's sacrifice protection, bound to the mark rather than to bloodline, so that wherever the lightning bolt rested, the ancient love magic rested with it. He was, he told himself, being thorough. He was protecting the girl, even as he used her. He had convinced himself these two things were compatible, because a man of his intelligence could convince himself of almost anything if he needed to believe it. The girl woke when the ritual reached its 7th step. She looked at him first, unfocused infant gaze, trying to resolve a thing that made no sense, and when the mark transferred, settling into her forehead with the heat of magic finding a new home, she cried, sharp and complete. The sound of something being rewritten without anyone asking. He held her until she stopped. It took some time. Hermione Potter, he said, to the dark of her dead parents' house. He did not apologize. The arithmetic, as he understood it, had no room. He left her on the Dursleys' doorstep as early dawn began, Not in the dead of night, but at the precise moment Vernon Dursley's alarm was due to go off. A small adjustment made with targeted magic so the door would open before the morning chill set in. He stood at the garden gate and watched the shape of the house rouse itself. He had placed a letter under her blanket. He had spent 90 minutes writing and rewriting it. The final version was 3 paragraphs. He had never in a life of letters found 3 paragraphs so difficult to get right. He still hadn't gotten them right. He folded them and placed them anyway, because the alternative was a girl on a doorstep with nothing. Vernon Dursley opened the door, looked down and understood that his calculation of a quiet life had just been significantly revised. 14 minutes later, Dumbledore stood in the kitchen of a house on Acacia Lane in Devon. He had entered through an unlocked kitchen window, an open-window household, built on reasonable faith in the world. The kitchen was warm, counters clean, a child's drawing of a molar anatomically precise in the way of children whose parents happened to be dentists. He placed the baby on the kitchen table, not a doorstep. This family deserved a kitchen. The adoption paperwork would follow through channels the Grangers had no reason to question. The boy's name, already threaded quietly into Muggle civil records through a ministry contact who believed he was processing a routine reassignment, was Harry Granger. The Potter name was stripped from him as completely as the visible scar. What remained on his right forearm? A small mark, barely 2 centimeters. Scar tissue where the blood mark ritual had completed its other end, where the anchor had terminated. In 11 years, Emma Granger would ask him about it, and he would say he didn't know, and she would say that was all right, that marks were sometimes just marks, and he would love her for that answer in a way he couldn't yet articulate. At nearly 4 a.m, Emma Granger came downstairs for water. She stopped in the kitchen doorway, looked at the table, crossed the room in 4 steps and picked the baby up. Not carefully, not tentatively, but immediately, the way people reach for things their hands recognize before their minds catch up. She held him against her chest and said something very quiet that Dumbledore couldn't hear through the glass. The baby's green eyes found her face. He settled. Dumbledore stood at the kitchen window for 1 moment longer. Something moved in him, old, unused, from a time before he had trained himself to think in strategies. He named it before turning away. Envy, for love that didn't calculate first. He disapparated. Behind him, Emma Granger held a boy she didn't yet have a name for, and she did not put him down. Harry Granger spoke his first complete sentence at 14 months. Not a word, a sentence. Grammatically correct, delivered across the breakfast table with the seriousness of someone who had been observing language for over a year and concluded the adults were doing it correctly and worth emulating. "The egg is too hot," he said. Emma put down her coffee. Daniel put down his fork. Their son had returned his attention to the egg in question and was waiting, with patient precision, for it to cool. Emma reached for the notebook she'd just started keeping. She would need many more. By 5, Harry had filled a composition book with documented phenomena, titled Things That Happen That Shouldn't. Each entry was specific, precise, written in careful capitals. Event 7 described a spider that had appeared to understand verbal requests, twice, under controlled conditions. Event 14 described a broken cup reassembling itself. 11 fragments returning to position, largest to smallest, over approximately 4 seconds, while he thought hard about wanting it unbroken. His hypothesis: desire may be a variable in the mechanism. Event 22 covered his first Parseltongue exchange with a slow worm in the garden, which he had not yet recognized as Parseltongue, only noted that the animal had responded to sound in ways inconsistent with documented behavior, and that the sound he had made felt correct in a way that English didn't always feel correct. He had essentially identified intentional magic before he knew the word applied. He called it the system. He was not afraid of it. Fear was a response to things you couldn't understand. He was systematically working to understand it, which made it interesting rather than frightening. Emma read his notebooks. Daniel read them too. They discussed, quietly and with care, what this might mean, and arrived independently at the same conclusion. They didn't know, and what they didn't know they should not flatten into something simpler than it was. They gave him more notebooks. They got him a university library card at 6. Daniel took him to the Natural History Museum on a Thursday morning when it was quiet, and Harry stood in front of the blue whale skeleton for 37 minutes and wrote 4 pages. They let him stay as long as he needed. At 7, Harry asked Emma directly why his forearm had the mark on it. She had clearly been preparing for this question. She sat down, she was very calm. She said she didn't know its origin, but that it had been there since the night she found him in the kitchen, and that she thought it was part of him and belonged to him. Like a signature? Harry said. Exactly like that, Emma said. He had filed this under insufficient data, but acceptable framing. He had returned to the notebook. Emma had put her hand briefly on the back of his head, the way she did when she was glad he existed and didn't have the words to say it in a way that wouldn't make him self-conscious. He leaned back against the touch, very briefly, and then returned to the pen. It was, he had noted later, the only physical language they had established for what they were to each other. Brief, warm, never explained. He had preserved it in his records, not as data, but as itself. By 9, 4 volumes and 3 library cards later, he had a working theory about Parseltongue. After a lengthy conversation with a garden snake he catalogued as S. The snake found him interesting for reasons it described as olfactory. Harry smelled like something old, specifically old in the way that meant once very powerful and recently changed. Harry filed this under unexplained variables and was, without being able to entirely account for why, delighted. He wrote to S 7 more times over the following years. S was consistently helpful with perspective. The magic also manifested in ways that fell outside the notebook's systematic framework. Once, at 8, he had been very unhappy, a feeling he rarely allowed to last long, and the rain outside had stopped mid-pour for 14 seconds and then started again. He documented this but noted that isolating the variable was difficult. Once, at 9, he felt the resonance for the first time, a note below his sternum that felt like a direction, a very distant pull, as if something somewhere was on the other end of a string he hadn't known was attached. He documented this too, with the notation, source unknown, possibly external, priority high. He was 9. He had identified the bond. In Little Whinging, Hermione Potter did not speak until she was nearly 2. This was not inability. She had catalogued the words, sorted their functions. What she had also understood, in the way of an infant raised in a cupboard under the stairs, was that words produced responses, and responses from the Dursleys were almost always worse than silence. She had performed this calculation before she had language for the word calculation, and she had arrived at the correct answer. She watched instead. The gap under the cupboard door let in a strip of light during the day, and nothing at night. She learned that strip of light by heart, when it shifted, when shadows crossed it, what each shadow meant. She built a map of the house in her mind, room by room, person by person, because knowing the territory was the first condition of surviving it. By the time she could walk, she could move through the house at night without producing a sound that the boards hadn't already learned to let her make. At 5 she found the school library. The librarian, Mrs. Chen, had run Cranbourne Primary's collection for 22 years and had developed a reliable taxonomy of child readers, the reluctant ones sent by teachers, the social ones seeking warmth, the genuinely curious who went quiet when they found what they needed, and the very rare kind who arrived already knowing that what they needed was here and that they intended to extract it systematically. The girl who appeared in the doorway one October Wednesday, small, careful-eyed, with a lightning bolt scar and a stillness that didn't belong in a 5-year-old body, belonged to the last category in the most complete form Mrs. Chen had ever encountered. She wanted everything, not randomly. She moved along shelves with systematic intent, making an inventory before committing to selection. She chose 3 books, sat at the corner table with the best light, read all 3 without getting up, without eating, without appearing to register that the afternoon had passed. When she left, she replaced them in exactly the right positions, with a tidiness that suggested the order of shelves was something she took seriously as a courtesy to whoever came next. Mrs. Chen began quietly ensuring the most relevant books sat at an accessible height. She also began keeping certain titles set aside under the desk, texts that children of 5 were not supposed to want, but that this child demonstrably did. She had a theory, watching the girl work through her second year of visits, about what the library was to her. Not leisure. Ammunition. By 7, Hermione was training in the back garden at 5 in the morning, in the gray light before anyone else stirred. She had read about martial arts, karate, judo, and a text on what the author called the philosophy of controlled force. And while formal instruction was not available to her, principles were. Control of body, control of breath. The way a fall absorbed or redirected energy depending on which muscles you held and which you released. Control of expression under pressure, which was a different discipline from the others but equally teachable. The magic had started at 4, a plate falling from Dudley's deliberate push, assembling itself piece by piece before anyone in the room processed what they'd seen. Petunia's hand caught her wrist before she could move. Petunia didn't know what she was punishing. Hermione filed it silently. This is a skill. Skills develop. By 8, she was practicing it deliberately, in the cupboard, in the dark, small enough that no one would see the light that sometimes accompanied her efforts. She discovered she could move objects without touching them, generate warmth or cold in a localized space, and that under extreme emotion the effect scaled significantly, which she then spent considerable effort learning to control, because a tool she couldn't control was a liability rather than an asset. By 9, when Dudley cornered her in the garden with 2 friends in a loose semicircle, and the expression of a boy who had decided this was going to be interesting, she stood perfectly still and looked at him with the patience of someone assessing variables. The air around her shifted. Not visibly, nothing moved, but a pressure built that the 3 boys felt in their chests and couldn't name. Dudley stopped mid-sentence. His friends took a step back, then another. Dudley followed and would describe it later as having better things to do. She watched them go, opened her book, found her page. She did not record the incident anywhere. Records could be found. What lived in her head was hers. Once, at 9, she also felt the pull, the same note below the sternum, a distant direction, as if something somewhere was looking for her and had not yet found her. She sat with it for a long time. She filed it under. This belongs to something I don't yet have enough information to identify. Priority, note, and retain. They arrived at Hogwarts on a September evening, not by boat across a black lake with the castle rising dramatically above. Harry had found the staff entrance in the Architectural Index of Hogwarts, a history, and they had slipped through a side passage, arriving at the castle doors, alongside the carriages, which produced a sharp look from Professor McGonagall and the resigned expression of a woman recalibrating her expectations about the year ahead. They had met on the train earlier that day, in the way significant things sometimes happen, not dramatically, but with the force of something inevitable recognized only afterward. Harry had been mid-question, asking Ron Weasley, who had wandered into his compartment and seemed too polite to leave, about the empirical relationship between a wizard's emotional state and their spell efficiency. When the door opened, and a girl with a lightning bolt scar stood in the entrance, doing a single comprehensive sweep of the compartment with her eyes. Those eyes arrived at Harry. They stopped. He felt it in the same moment. A note struck somewhere below his sternum, the same note he had documented at 9, now close enough to be unmistakable. Not distant, not directional, here. She felt it too. He could see the moment it landed, a fractional sharpening in her expression, the look of something long awaited arriving and being immediately catalogued. "Sit," she said. A decision, not an invitation. She sat across from him and met his eyes directly, which most people didn't. "Your name, Harry Granger." A pause. "Yours?" "Hermione Potter." The name carried weight he recognized from 6 weeks of reading everything available about the wizarding world. He noted this with interest. His primary interest was the frequency in his chest, which had intensified the moment she sat down, not painfully, but insistently the way a compass needle insists on north. "You feel that," he said. "Yes," she said. She had been feeling it since the train crossed the border, had tracked it intensifying as they moved north, and had spent most of the journey following it to its source without appearing to do anything more than read. Ron looked between them. "Feel what?" They both looked at Ron, then at each other. "Never mind," they said in unison. Ron opened his mouth, closed it. He decided visibly to process this later, possibly significantly later. He was a pragmatic person. He had brothers who had prepared him to accept that certain things happened in the vicinity of extraordinary people that were better engaged with than questioned too aggressively. Harry opened his notebook, wrote, "Frequency confirmed external, reciprocal, not internal anomaly. Two-directional. Source, unknown. Priority, highest." Hermione watched him write without comment. Harry had the impression she was conducting her own version in whatever internal system she used instead of a notebook. He had the further impression her internal system was at least as detailed as his, and possibly more efficiently organized. This made him feel something he identified upon reflection as relief. He had never before met someone for whom the organization of information was not just a habit, but a necessary condition of functioning. The sorting happened in a side hall connecting to the Great Hall through carved doors. McGonagall had made practical adjustments to the traditional procession. The Hat's assessment of Hermione took 58 seconds, and said, in the private dark only she could hear, "This is not a famous mind. This is a battle mind. There is discipline here I haven't encountered in decades, and power under such compression I cannot determine its ceiling. But you have chosen yourself every single day in conditions that would have unmade most people. You have been building something in a space that wasn't meant for building. That is the deepest Gryffindor thing there is, and it always will be." Harry's assessment took 71 seconds. He said, internally to a voice listening with genuine interest, "Where I can learn the most quickly, while maintaining the highest probability of successful outcomes for the people I choose to protect." The word protect surprised him. He had meant to say work with. The Hat said, "Interesting choice of words. In that case, they were both in Gryffindor." At the feast that followed, Draco Malfoy leaned across the table with the confidence of someone who had been taught that his opinion of people was itself a form of authority. He said, at a volume calculated to carry, that the famous Potter girl had low standards in her company. Hermione put down her fork. "Draco Malfoy," she said, "your father claimed the imperious curse to escape Azkaban. Your mother's family has spent 3 generations disinheriting its own members, until they've nearly accomplished their own extinction." She picked her fork back up. "What exactly are you defending?" The table went very still. Malfoy's face moved through white, then red. He had arrived prepared for a first year. "Harry Granger," Harry said pleasantly, not looking up from his notebook. "Muggle-born, here to understand the system comprehensively enough to improve it. Pleasure to meet you." Malfoy left. He didn't speak to either of them for a week. Neville Longbottom, seated to Harry's left, had watched the exchange with the expression of someone who wanted to remember this. "That was," he said carefully, "something." "It was accurate," Harry said. "Yes," Neville said, in a tone that suggested this was exactly what made it something. He looked at Hermione with the careful assessment of someone deciding whether to trust a thing, and then at Harry, and then back at his dinner. He had decided he was in. He had decided in the way he decided most things, quietly, without announcement, and then permanently. Potions in the Dungeons that October produced the most significant first lesson Severus Snape had conducted in 15 years of teaching, though he would never describe it in those terms. Harry documented everything. The introduction was, rhetorically, a masterwork designed to establish intellectual dominance before any instruction began. The content was genuinely sophisticated, potions as magic operating through an entirely different channel than wand work, following rules that conventional magical theory hadn't fully mapped. The delivery was a power structure being erected in real time, each word chosen to position Snape as sole authority on a subject the students needed and could only access through him. Harry tracked both dimensions with the attention he gave things that were both substantively interesting and strategically significant. He wrote in the margins, "Technique, intellectual gatekeeping as authority foundation. Effective but brittle. Depends on audience not knowing the field." When Snape's quiz arrived and the draught of Living Death's counter-agent question landed on Hermione, Harry watched her process the decision. Not what is the answer, but how much of the answer to give. She delivered the textbook response. Correct, complete, deliberately unilluminating about anything above curriculum level. A tactical choice made in under 3 seconds. Snape's lip moved fractionally. He escalated to 7th-year material, searching for a ceiling. Harry set his pen down. "The counter-agent is Jobberknoll Feather Tincture," he said, in the same conversational tone he used for everything, "but the mechanism is wrong in both the standard and 7th-year texts. The Jobberknoll Feather doesn't chemically interrupt the soporific compound. It disrupts the draught's binding field through resonant interference. You're not reversing the potion. You're destabilizing its architecture. The analogy in Muggle physics would be sonoluminescence, a sound frequency destabilizing a stable liquid state. The incomplete mechanism description is why students brew counteragents that work at standard doses but fail against stronger variants. They're targeting the wrong layer." The room was entirely silent. Snape looked at him. The look lasted fractionally longer than his pauses for effect. This one was genuine, not theatrical. Actual reassessment. That, Snape said, is a heterodox interpretation. Yes, Harry said. I developed it cross-referencing the ingredient list with known magical properties last week. Would you like to see the notation? I have it in 3 points to Gryffindor, Snape said, in the tone of a man for whom those words cost something unbudgeted. Do not make a habit of interrupting class. He turned to the board and stood there, back to the room, a beat longer than necessary. The practical that followed, a calming draught, methodology prescribed, ingredients pre-measured, Harry approached differently. He read the methodology, set it aside, and modified the stirring protocol based on ghost letters visible on the blackboard's lower left corner from a previous class. 7 clockwise, 2 counterclockwise, standard for binding compounds. He analyzed the ingredient interactions and determined that inverting the ratio with a deliberate 1-second hesitation at the transition point, timed to maximum suspension of the binding agents, would produce cleaner molecular alignment. His draught ran 3 shades deeper than the reference standard. Snape saw it from across the room before he reached the station. He stood over the cauldron for several seconds. How? He said. Flat, not rhetorical. Harry explained the modification, the timing, the theoretical basis, offered to write it as a reproducible methodology note with full calculations. 10 points to Gryffindor, Snape said. Bottle it. Leave it on my desk. He did not make eye contact with Harry for the remainder of the lesson. That evening, in his private research notes, he added 1 line without attribution. Hesitation protocol at binding inversion point. Test for reproducibility. If confirmed, revise Year 1 curriculum. Below it, in smaller script. First year. Muggle-born. Explain. Walking out of the dungeons, Hermione said, You knew that answer before he called on me. Yes, you let him try to humiliate me first. I wanted to see how he responded to resistance, and how you responded to him. Both pieces of data were useful. He paused. The deliberate underperformance, then the forced escalation. That was sophisticated social strategy for a first year. She looked at him sideways. The look had something in it he couldn't immediately classify. You're the only person who has ever called my silence sophisticated. The Dursleys called it insolence, he said. Not a guess, a conclusion from 8 weeks of building a working model of her from available evidence. She stopped walking. He stopped too. They were in the corridor outside the dungeon stairs, students moving around them, none of them noticing 2 11-year-olds standing in the middle of a corridor, doing something that wasn't quite an argument, and wasn't quite a revelation. How did you know about the Dursleys? She said. I inferred you have a specific pattern around authority figures who use cruelty as an organizational tool. Extended practice surviving that environment. The origin narrows significantly from there. He paused. I'm sorry, that was accurate, she said. Don't apologize for being accurate. He looked at her. She looked at him. Something shifted between them that was not the resonance itself, but adjacent to it. The quality of a recognition that had moved from intellectual to personal. The Grangers are good people, he said, and it came out without the framing he usually applied to personal statements, which surprised him. I know, she said. I can tell from how you said your mother's name on the platform. You heard 1 word? The way you said it was sufficient data? He opened his notebook. We should compare observations about the resonance. I've documented 43 instances since I first noticed it at 9. You've been tracking it too. In my head, she said. I don't write things down. I know, I inferred that too. He turned to a fresh page. Would you debrief verbally? I'll take notes. She considered this with the seriousness she gave actual decisions. Then, after dinner, the library has a table in the far left corner not visible from the door. I'll find it, he said. In the library at midnight, 2 weeks later, with 5 books open and their resonance research underway, Harry found the text that changed their model. When 2 magics of common source are separated by art and reunited by proximity, they will seek completion as water seeks its level. No artifice of man can prevent this reunion. It is the nature of magic to be whole. He set his pen down. Common source. The resonance wasn't a phenomenon to catalog. It was a correction. Something had been divided that was meant to be unified. Hermione read the passage when he pushed the book toward her. Her face went through the specific blankness she wore during concentration, so complete it consumed all available processing. The scar on my forehead, she said when she finished. I've always known it doesn't belong to me. I've had it since birth. But it didn't come from me. It feels placed. My magic has never felt like a new acquisition, Harry said. It feels like something made quieter than it's supposed to be, suppressed rather than absent. The candle between them guttered without wind. Neither commented on it. One person had the knowledge, Hermione said. The access, the reason. One person, Harry agreed. Neither said the name. It occupied the space between them, larger for remaining unspoken. Hermione reached for the inheritance resonance text at the same moment. Harry moved to show her the relevant passage. Their hands touched the open page simultaneously. The resonance surged. Every book on the table lifted 2 inches. The corridor's candles went from maintenance burn to full flame. The air between them became briefly visible. 2 distinct signatures. Unmistakable. Harry's cold and architecturally organized. Hermione's warm and expanding. The outward pressure of something that had been compressed for a decade, suddenly given space. For 3 seconds they were visible to each other below the surface. Below the notebook and the silence. Below Granger and Potter. Below everything placed on them and around them and told to them about who they were. Then the books fell. 5 simultaneous impacts on the wood. The candles held their new brightness for a moment, then steadied. Harry's hands were flat on the table. Hermione's were in her lap. "We investigate together," she said. Her voice was level. She had decided not to be afraid of this, and the decision was holding. Everything we find, we share. We don't go to Dumbledore until we understand what was done. "Agreed," Harry said. He extended his hand. She took it. The handshake sent a smaller version of the surge up both their arms. Controlled, brief, a single pulse like a key completing its turn. No books lifted. The candles held. Something settled between them with the solidity of a decision made by 2 people simultaneously. The weight of an agreement between equals. Percy Weasley found them on the way back at 1 a.m. and deployed a prefect speech that Harry dismantled in 4 sentences by referencing the procedural consequences of a prefect's documented harassment of younger students conducting academic research. Percy awarded them 5 points each for initiative and walked away with the pace of a man who had decided that pace could function as dignity. "Initiative," Hermione said when he was gone. It was all he had available, Harry said. They walked back through the quiet castle in the small hours, and the frequency between them had the quality of something confirmed. Not louder or different, but more settled the way a hypothesis feels after the first clean experimental result. Not proven. Not yet. But closer. The stone resolved itself in June. At the end of a corridor Harry had been mapping since September. He had known about it since October. 3 converging sources. Hagrid's unguarded mention of Gringotts' business, a Daily Prophet archive piece about a vault break-in before term began, and the 3rd-floor corridor's wards, which felt from outside like something within them required containing. By February he had the full picture. The Philosopher's Stone, moved from Gringotts to Hogwarts after a failed theft attempt, protected by a sequence of challenges designed by various staff members. By May, the analysis was complete. Professor Quirrell was the operative threat, hosting a spirit anchor, a form of non-corporeal Voldemort, surviving in a living host because the original body was gone. They went themselves in June, because going to Dumbledore would reveal how much they knew and how they knew it. And they had spent 8 months deciding that giving Dumbledore information was not strategically sound until they understood precisely what he was capable of doing with it. Ron Weasley had followed them, in the way of someone who had decided these 2 people were his people, and that was the permanent condition of things. He had spent 8 months watching them and deciding, and he was not someone who made this kind of decision casually. He was in the chess chamber when they arrived, the board mid-game, the pieces at full intimidating scale. He solved it by sacrificing himself with the strategic precision and genuine courage that told Harry everything essential about Ron Weasley's character, a person who faced the worst version of a situation without flinching and without drama, who looked at the board and understood immediately what it was asking, and gave what was required without complaint. They stepped past his unconscious form with the weight of people who intended to come back for him. Snape's puzzle, 7 bottles, a verse, designed as misdirection, resolved in 90 seconds. The logic was positional, not literary. Reading the verse as a poem gave false information. Reading it as a matrix gave the answer. The smallest flask went forward. Harry pocketed it. The designer was testing whether you trusted pattern recognition over explicit instruction, he said. I'd like to tell him I appreciated it. Tell him after, Hermione said. The Mirror of Erised, showed Harry his own face. Not the face he wore, but the face behind the name he'd been given. Recognition rather than reflection. The stone materialized in his pocket, drawn by someone who wanted to find it rather than use it. Quirrell lasted long enough to identify, via the voice from beneath his turban, that the scar was wrong, that the soul beneath the lightning bolt did not match expectation, that the true target had been hidden. "Correct," said Hermione Potter. She hit him with 10 years of back garden training and he left the ground. The wraith that tore free from Quirrell's dissolving form found no purchase in the chamber and howled itself out of the story. They walked out together, past the dissolution, into the tunnel that led back to the school. They gave the stone to McGonagall, with a 7-page written account including Voldemort's exact words about the scar. McGonagall read it with the expression of a woman revising several long-held positions simultaneously. The stone was relocated before Dumbledore finished reading page 3. Second year opened with the message on the wall, "The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the air, beware." Mrs. Norris hung petrified from a torch bracket, eyes filmed and still. The water on the floor caught the torchlight in a puddle that had done most of the damage. Harry studied the puddle, the angle of the tail visible beyond the corner, the distance from the nearest reflective surface. "Basilisk," he said quietly. "Reflected contact. Not direct. The victim saw it in the puddle. That's why she's petrified rather than dead." "The air of Slytherin framing is political," Hermione said. "The mechanism is biological, Parseltongue." There was also the matter of a diary. In Diagon Alley the previous August, during the chaos at Flourish and Blots, an old diary, black-covered, 50 years old, had fallen from Ginny Weasley's cauldron. Harry had picked it up, felt the wrong density of magic inside it, not the weight of a memory, but the weight of something alive, watching, waiting, and slipped it into his bag before anyone noticed. He spent September documenting its properties and arrived at a conclusion in October. A Horcrux, a piece of Tom Riddle's soul sealed in an object with the specific intention of influencing whoever wrote inside it, exerting pressure in the specific direction of the writer's fears and impulses. He destroyed it using a method drawn from the Peverell Grimoire, a basilisk venom-adjacent reagent synthesized from chamber-collected materials applied to the object's binding surface. The diary had made a sound like water finding a drain, and then it had been empty. But it had already been active before he found it. Ginny had been writing in it since August, and the residual commands embedded in the chamber's architecture had already been triggered. The chamber opened before the diary was destroyed, which meant the basilisk was now running on decade-old instructions with no active director, no living puppet, no one to tell it who the enemies were anymore. "I can talk to it," Harry said. They convened in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom with McGonagall, Sprout, and Snape. Snape, who arrived with the air of someone told something extraordinary, and withholding judgment until evidence materialized, which was, Harry had come to understand, his most reliable operating mode. Harry crouched before the sink's carved serpent tap and spoke in Parseltongue. The sound of it filled the bathroom differently than English did, older, with harmonics that the tile walls seemed to have been waiting for. The sink opened, the chamber descended. The negotiation that followed was unlike anything the Hogwarts staff would have predicted had they been present. The basilisk was vast, 60 feet of ancient creature, 1,000 years of compressed waiting, coiled in a space large enough to contain it but too small for the scale of its age. It had been alone in the chamber's dark for decades between periods of use, running instructions written by a boy who had been dead for 50 years, waiting for something to serve that wasn't coming back. Harry addressed it directly, in the old grammar the creature used. "You were placed here to protect this school. The school is still here. But the person who gave you instructions has been gone for a century, and you have been in a sealed room following orders with no one to serve. That is not a purpose. That is a cage." A long silence. The basilisk considered him with senses that didn't require eyes. "The little speaker understands cages," it said. "I have read about them," Harry said. "That is almost the same thing." He offered expanded caverns in the eastern passages, light where she could choose to have it, territory and recognition, rather than imprisonment, in exchange for a new compact: protect the school, all of it, everyone in it, without the definition of worth that Tom Riddle had written into her original instructions. The basilisk accepted. The compact settled between them with the density of something ancient, acknowledging something that was right, even if it arrived 1,000 years late. Ginny Weasley, who had been drifting for a month under the influence of something that wasn't herself, came back gradually over the following week, the way a person returns from a long fever, confused, shaky, intensely grateful for ordinary things. Ron sat with her through most of it. Harry noted this as characteristic. Gilderoy Lockhart, who intercepted them outside the bathroom with a fully charged Obliviate mid-arc, received his own spell back at full force off Hermione's shield. He sat down on the floor and examined his wand with innocent curiosity. Encountering it as if for the first time, he would spend several months at St. Mungo's rediscovering, largely from scratch, what things were for. His literary career ended on a bathroom floor. The school gained a guardian that needed no further instruction. Over the following weeks, as the chamber was quietly documented and its extraordinary archive of Founder-era texts catalogued, Harry and Hermione began spending evenings there. The basilisk, whom Harry called S in the same vein as his Surrey garden snake, seemed to find this acceptable. She was not conversational by nature, but she was present, and her presence gave the chamber a quality the library lacked: certainty. Nothing entered without her awareness. It was in the chamber's archive that Harry first found the Peverell Grimoire, a hand-bound volume written in 3 languages, the most significant being a form of magical notation that predated modern wand work. He spent 4 months translating it. Hermione learned the notation alongside him and improved his translations in 7 places, which he documented in the margins with attribution. It was the grimoire that gave them the bonded cast theory, not as a technique described, but as a principle inferred from a passage about the ancient unity of magical pairs, and what was possible when 2 cores with a common original source were brought into deliberate alignment. The principle requires practice to confirm, Harry said, reading the passage a 4th time. Of course it does, Hermione said. She had already cleared space on the chamber floor. They began that evening. It was messy. It was, for the first 12 sessions, genuinely uncomfortable. The attempt to join 2 magical cores required both of them to let their defenses relax below the threshold they each maintained instinctively, and this turned out to be significantly harder than either of them had expected. Harry's defenses were conceptual, built from careful categorization and deliberate framing, easy to see and hard to release. Hermione's were physical, the compression she had practiced since 4 years old in a cupboard, and the relaxation of that compression felt, as she described it once, like trying to unclench a fist you'd been holding for a decade. They kept going anyway, 3 times a week, then 5. Through the end of 2nd year, and across the summer, and into 3rd year, between the legal work and the research and the serious case documentation, they built the connection the way they built everything, methodically, incrementally, with attention to detail. By the time they were in 3rd year, the connection worked. By the time they were in 4th year, it worked under pressure. By January of that year, they could maintain it in full combat conditions, 312 sessions, and they stopped counting at 312 because the count had ceased to be the point. The summer between 2nd and 3rd year, they went to Gringotts. At the front desk, when Hermione stated their request, a soul verification audit, 2 individuals, under the 1722 Warlock's agreement, the teller called for an elder before she finished her sentence. The elder arrived in 90 seconds, looked at both of them with eyes that registered and filed simultaneously, and led them deeper into the bank without speaking. The deeper halls of Gringotts were not the marble of the public entrance. They were older stone, rougher, lit by sconces that burned blue-white and threw no shadows. The audit chamber was small and intense. An inheritance key of obsidian sat on a central plinth, its surface catching the light in a way that suggested more than simple reflection. A witness record book lay open beside it, its pages startlingly white, the kind of white that meant they had never been wrong and had never needed to be corrected. Blood and intention, the elder said. The key resonates with its true inheritor. The witness record documents all claims with the binding authority of Goblin sovereignty accords. Is this understood and agreed? They both said yes. Harry pressed his thumb to the key. It sang, a pure, bell-clear note from no visible mechanism, resonating in the stone walls with the quality of a frequency the room had been built to recognize. The obsidian surface bloomed to deep gold from the contact point outward, slow and complete, like something being confirmed at last, the way a proof resolves, from the first assumption through to the thing the universe had been waiting to say. The witness record filled itself in script neither English nor Goblin, the record language of magic writing without mediation. The elder read the pages. His face did not change. His stillness did. Hermione pressed her thumb to the key. The gold receded. The obsidian held. A single annotation line appeared in the record in smaller, different ink. Acknowledgement without inheritance. Presence without line. The individual presenting as Hermione Potter, the elder said in the careful language of a legal finding, is not the blood heir to the Potter, Black, or Peverell lines. The blood heir is seated to my left. He looked at Harry. Your registered identity is Harry Granger. Your blood identity is Harry James Potter, sole blood heir to the ancient and noble houses of Potter and Peverell, and secondary heir, following Sirius Orion Black, to the House of Black. He paused. Mr. Black is alive, currently imprisoned in Azkaban without trial. The room held the weight of it. Who did this? Hermione said, very quiet. The voice she used when everything extraneous had been stripped away. The blood masquerade that was performed carries a specific magical signature, the elder said. We have encountered it in one other context, a ward modification made to Hogwarts' foundational structure on the first night of November. In the year 1981, the modification accessed Founder-era archive materials restricted to a list of individuals requiring no enumeration. He let the conclusion exist without naming it. One person, Harry said, the documentation is clear. Harry formally claimed the Potter Lordship, the Peverell Lordship, and acknowledged the Black secondary heirship. The record added lines for each, with ink that moved like certainty. He requested sealed storage of the audit results until he was ready to use them. 7 separate sealed vaults, the elder said. The goblins have an interest in this case. We were defrauded for 11 years. We do not forget fraud. A pause that held its own emphasis. We also do not charge for our interest. They walked out into Diagon Alley's afternoon, and Lucius Malfoy was crossing the main hall as they reached the doors. There for a routine appointment, unhurried, deploying the social performance he used toward people he considered beneath him. Harry stepped into his path. Lord Malfoy. My name is Harry Potter. He produced a certified goblin record scroll. I'm beginning a comprehensive review of all transactions involving the Potter, Black, and Peverell accounts since the autumn of 1981. Your family's name appears several times in those records. I look forward to reviewing the details. He smiled, the smile of someone who has completed all the relevant arithmetic. Lucius Malfoy looked at the scroll, looked at the unremarkable Muggle-raised face. Something moved through his expression that wasn't common there. Genuine uncertainty. He walked past them toward the teller's desk with the pace of a man who has decided pace can substitute for composure, and was finding the substitution insufficient. That summer unfolded in the specific way of summers after something large has happened. Not quiet, not settled, but holding the space where something once stood, and learning the shape of the absence. Hermione spent 2 weeks at the Granger house in Devon at Harry's explicit and repeated invitation, which was the first time she had been a guest somewhere rather than an imposition, and which she handled with the care of someone who didn't entirely trust the experience to last. Emma Granger had made the guest room the way Emma Granger made everything, thoroughly, with attention to detail and an intuition for what was needed that Harry had long since stopped being surprised by. She had put books in the room, good ones, not decorative ones, but books that she had thought Hermione would want, drawn from Harry's ongoing descriptions of her reading interests, which were comprehensive and accurate. Hermione had stood in the doorway of the room looking at the shelves for a long moment before she said anything. The one on structural logic isn't in print anymore, she said. I looked for it. I know, Emma said. Daniel found it through a specialist catalog. It took 3 months. Hermione looked at her. Something moved across her face that Harry from down the hallway was careful not to observe directly. He went back to his notebook. She stayed for 11 days. She and Harry worked the Sirius Black case from the Devon kitchen table, with tea from Emma and digestive biscuits that appeared at appropriate intervals without anyone asking. They built the 17-page brief in 4 sittings. On the 5th day, when Harry looked up from the draft and found Hermione staring at the ceiling with the expression she wore during deep processing, he said, "You can stay longer, you know. There's no rule." "I know," she said. She did not look at him. "That's what makes it complicated." He went back to his notes. She went back to the ceiling. Emma appeared in the doorway, looked at both of them, and set down another plate of biscuits without comment. Hermione stayed for 11 days. She wrote 3 letters to Mrs. Chen from the Devon kitchen table, the first letters she had ever written to anyone that weren't about something she needed. The legal brief was 17 pages when Harry finished it in August before third year. He had spent the summer pulling every available source on wizarding legal procedure through the Goblin Archive reading access. 3 texts, 2 from a Muggle antiquarian who didn't know what he was selling. 1 recovered from the Chamber's restricted archive that predated the current ministry by 3 centuries, and contained provisions never formally repealed. What the ministry's own certified records showed was extraordinary in its inadequacy. No trial held, emergency powers invoked. The notation in a ministry official's handwriting that Harry subsequently identified and filed. Veritaserum available, unused. Peter Pettigrew's supposed remains processed by Muggle police as a gas explosion, accepted by the magical world without examination. 3 witnesses could have testified about the secret keeper arrangement: Dumbledore, Remus Lupin, and Pettigrew himself, who was not dead. Harry had confirmed this through the Marauder's map, obtained from Fred and George Weasley in an exchange that saved Fred's eyebrows and provided them with 2 months of advanced potions calculations. The map showed a name in the Gryffindor boys' dormitory attached to no visible person: Peter Pettigrew, in Ron Weasley's possession for 12 years, living as a rat named Scabbers. Ron, when Harry told him, sat with this information for 11 minutes before saying, very quietly, "That thing slept in my bed." Harry documented the reaction under Primary Source Responses to Significant Information, Recalibration Period. 11 minutes, consistent with someone who processes through lived implication rather than abstract reason. He noted this as a compliment in the margin. Harry sealed this information in a goblin vault, built the brief, and signed it with his actual name, Harry James Potter, Lord Potter, for the first time on a document leaving his hands. It felt different than he expected. Not ceremonial, just true. Cornelius Fudge's office sent a form acknowledgement and nothing else. Harry filed the non-response and sent a copy to the Daily Prophet. Hermione's accompanying letter was 1 page. She used her Wizengamot, recognized status, formally acknowledged in the spring of 1982, when the Chamber honored the blood mark she carried, and laid out the facts of Sirius Black's case in sequence. No trial. Veritaserum. Unused. Evidence improperly handled. 12 years in Azkaban, her 3rd paragraph closed. I make this request as the person credited with Voldemort's defeat, a designation I did not choose and do not rely on, but which carries public weight I am choosing, on this occasion, to use. An imprisonment without trial is not justice. It is justice's absence. The headline the following morning: Girl who lived demands justice. Potter calls for Wizengamot hearing. Fudge's office called within 3 hours. The hearing was held in early September, 2 days into 3rd year. Dumbledore was recused through a provision in the 1903 Hearing Reform Act. Any petitioner holding an ancient house seat could request the chief warlock step aside from proceedings in which he had a documented interest. Dumbledore's documented interest was his acknowledged role in placing Sirius Black in the arrangement preceding his imprisonment. He accepted the recusal with the grace of a man recognizing a clean trap and choosing not to fight it. Remus Lupin was in the gallery. Harry had found him through a chain of correspondence that started with the Goblin Archive and ended with a letter to a post office box in Scotland that had been checked exactly once a month for 12 years. Lupin had come, quietly and without announcement, and sat in the gallery with the expression of a man who had spent 12 years believing the wrong thing, and was now about to have the correct version of events installed, which was both a relief and its own kind of grief. He wore robes that had been well made once and were still well kept, the clothes of someone who cared for what he had. Peter Pettigrew arrived under ministry guard, captured the previous week through the Marauder's map, and a counter-transformation spell Hermione had spent 4 months developing from the Chamber's restricted archive. A goblin witness had been present for the capture, establishing chain of custody that no ministry official could interfere with. Under Veritaserum, Pettigrew confirmed everything: the secret keeper arrangement and the switch, the street, the explosion, the 13 deaths he had arranged to frame someone else for, 12 years as a rat in Ron Weasley's possession, the flat, factual voice of someone who had run out of directions except truth. Snape was called to the witness position. He wore composure the way a man wears his only available armor. Harry stood for cross-examination. Professor Snape, was the understanding that Sirius Black was the Potter's secret keeper formally verified before his arrest? A pause that held the weight of its own cost. It was not. It was informal, assumed, undocumented and unconfirmed through any official channel. Correct. And to your knowledge, was anyone in a position of authority asked to verify this arrangement, under oath or veritaserum, before Mr. Black was sent to Azkaban? Snape's composure held the way things hold when the structure beneath them is being tested. Not to my knowledge, he said. So the basis for 12 years of imprisonment was an unverified assumption held informally by a small number of people, none of whom were required to confirm it before a man was put in Azkaban. That would be an accurate summary, Snape said, in the tone of a man for whom accuracy was a professional value he could not abandon even when it cost him something. Thank you, Professor Snape. No further questions. The chamber voted, 43 for acquittal, 9 against, 2 abstentions. Sirius Black walked out of the Ministry building into September light, free with Harry on his left and Hermione 3 steps behind. He stopped on the Ministry steps and looked at the sky. He had not seen it without bars across it in 12 years. Harry stood beside him and said nothing, because some moments resist annotation. Lupin was a step behind them, and after a moment Sirius's hand found his arm, and they stood that way on the Ministry steps for a long time. 2 people on the far side of an enormous injustice, simply standing in light they had been refused for too long. You were 12 when you filed the first petition, Sirius said, eventually. His voice had the roughness of something that hadn't been used warmly in years. I had to wait until the Goblin legal channel was established. The direct Ministry approach wasn't viable before that. Sirius made a sound that was almost a laugh. Then it became one, genuine, unguarded, the laugh of someone rediscovering an old capability. James, he said quietly to the afternoon air. James, you should see this. Harry opened his notebook. Tell me about my parents, he said. I'll take notes. Sirius laughed again. He started talking. Harry wrote. Hermione, 3 steps back, gave them the moment. Lupin listened with his eyes bright and his face doing the complicated work of a man with a lot of feeling that had been waiting a long time for a place to land. Fred and George Weasley, who had appeared without being asked on the morning the acquittal was announced, and were now standing on the pavement below the Ministry steps, eating cauldron cakes with the satisfied air of people who had come to witness something important. Said nothing useful, but were exactly, Harry thought, where they needed to be. The following months were not clean. Sirius's recovery was not a straight line. He had been in Azkaban for 12 years, and 12 years at the mercy of Dementors left a particular kind of damage, not easily visible, not loudly expressed, but present in the way his eyes would go distant mid-sentence, or the way he startled at sounds that didn't require startling, or the weeks in late autumn when he was simply quiet in a way that carried weight. Harry came to Grimmauld Place as often as he was able. He brought the notebook, always the notebook, but he learned across those months that the notebook was not always what was needed. Sometimes what was needed was to sit in the kitchen in the early morning, while Sirius made tea and told stories about James Potter that were not in any archive, that could only come from the person who had been there. Harry wrote them down later, in a separate volume he labeled only J, and he read it more than he would ever admit, and never annotated it at all. Sirius, in turn, proved a better strategist than Harry had accounted for. He had spent 12 years with nothing but his own mind, and a mind like Sirius Black's, deprived of external input, turns inward with considerable force. He had thought about the wizarding world's structural failures in ways Harry hadn't reached yet, not through the same analytical framework, but through the framework of someone who had lived inside those failures and had a long time to map their shape from the inside. The problem, Sirius said one evening, sitting across from Harry in the kitchen with tea going cold between them, is that people who benefit from the structure are the ones who get to decide when the structure is worth changing. The goblins understand this. That's why they're useful. I've read the Goblin Sovereignty Accords, Harry said. I know. Sirius looked at him. Have you read the parts that weren't ratified? He hadn't. He opened his notebook. Lupin visited on weekends. He had taken a position doing independent research. Werewolf legislation was slowly becoming something that could be examined in public without immediate professional death, partly because of the broader reform momentum, and partly because Harry had quietly inserted a werewolf exemption provision into the Magical Welfare Act review, in terms that made it difficult to object to, without also objecting to the Muggle-born. Provisions which were politically inadvisable. Lupin knew Harry had done this, and had said nothing about it except to leave a plant on the Grimmauld Place doorstep that Harry didn't recognize. which turned out, when he looked it up, to be a variety grown specifically in northern Scotland as a gift offering for someone who had done you an unasked service. Harry pressed the leaf in the back of Volume 7. Fourth year brought the Triwizard Tournament, and Harry spent 11 minutes on the first morning studying the Goblet of Fire before he formed his hypothesis. The blue-white flames didn't consume the wood beneath them. Magical combustion, not chemical, which meant the goblet processed entries as magical intent rather than text. The one champion per school rule described what the goblet had historically produced, not a specification of what it could produce. The goblet was older than the school-based structure, older than the tournament itself, older than the statute of secrecy. It arbitrated by principles that predated all the current categories. If it reads intent rather than text, Hermione said, standing beside him on the second morning, a joint entry from a unified ancient source wouldn't register as two students from one school. It would register as one sovereign representation from an entity predating the school structure, Harry said. The House of Potter, on the Peverell side, predates Hogwarts by centuries. The goblet is a magical arbitrating intelligence. I believe it recognizes the category. She audited the logic carefully. She had already decided she was checking for gaps. And if it doesn't select us, then we're not in the tournament. Also acceptable. You genuinely don't care whether we compete. I care whether the mechanism works the way I think it does. The tournament tests that hypothesis. Competing is secondary. They submitted on a Sunday evening. One entry, both hands on the parchment, released together into the blue-white flames. The ancient and noble house of Potter, in the persons of Harry James Potter, Lord Potter, and Hermione Potter, bearer of the blood mark of Lily Potter née Evans, submits this entry as a joint sovereign representation. One entry, one representation. Two bearers. The flames accepted it without ceremony. Something else was running in parallel. A man named Alastor Moody had arrived at Hogwarts in a trunk, bound and unconscious. The person wearing his face and drinking polyjuice was Bartemius Crouch Jr., operating on Voldemort's instructions. Ensure Harry Potter reached the tournament's cup, which Crouch had already rigged as a portkey to a graveyard in Little Hangleton. He had confounded the goblet to produce a fourth entry, expecting one name. Two names were a problem he hadn't been given instructions to solve. Harry identified the behavioral inconsistencies in Moody. By November, the specific tells of a man performing a personality rather than inhabiting one. The wand hand favoring angles inconsistent with Moody's documented injuries. A secondary magical frequency detectable only to someone paying the kind of attention Harry paid to anomalies. He told Hermione they documented everything and prepared for the cup to be a trap. The real Moody was located in April, alive, contained in a trunk in the defense classroom, 7 months malnourished, by McGonagall and Snape, following an anonymous tip delivered through the Gringotts correspondence channel. Crouch Jr. was taken into custody before the final task. The portkey remained in the cup. Crouch confirmed its destination under Verite Serum. Harry and Hermione continued preparing for what they knew was coming. The three other champions became, through the long months of the tournament, something more than competitors. Victor Krum found Harry and Hermione at dinner in November, with the directness of someone who had decided on a thing and saw no value in circling it. He wanted to understand the orbital keyroom analysis. He had watched Harry's approach and correctly identified it as a methodology rather than instinct. Harry explained. Krum was quiet for a long time, then said, "You prepared for a dragon in September, before you were selected." Harry confirmed. Krum looked at them both, and made a visible decision to be interested rather than threatened. He became a reliable presence at the library's far table after that, trading methodologies with the focused seriousness of someone who understood that the most valuable competition was the kind that raised everyone's level. By February, they had developed a shorthand, a way of moving through problems together that required very little language. Fleur Delacour, whose Vila heritage operated not as surface glamour, but as a deeper ambient force that most people registered without understanding, identified Harry and Hermione's working dynamic by October and adjusted her competitive approach accordingly. Not because she feared them, but because she was precise about what she was dealing with. And she had not come to England to be imprecise. She and Hermione found common ground in late December over a defense text Fleur had sourced from Beauxbaton's archive, covering directed force magic through a different theoretical lens. The conversation lasted 4 hours. Krum, when they told him about it, said he wished he had known earlier. Cedric Diggory, Hufflepuff champion and fundamentally decent person, had noticed enough by January to ask Harry directly whether something was going to happen at the final task that he should know about. Harry looked at him for a moment, then he told him, "The cup was rigged as a portkey to a graveyard. Don't touch it when you reach it." Cedric was quiet for a long moment. "You're telling me this," he said finally. "You don't have to. You're a person," Harry said. It seemed relevant. Cedric nodded once, with the gravity of someone taking something important into their keeping. He didn't ask further questions. He walked away from the cup when he reached the center in June. He stood 50 meters back and watched the gold-threaded light when Harry and Hermione touched the handles together. He testified to the ministry for 6 hours afterward, and his account was so comprehensive and so clear that 2 Wizengamot members said it was the best witness testimony they had heard in 20 years. The Halloween announcement produced what Harry had designed it to produce. Dumbledore reached into the goblet, read 3 school champions, Krum, Delacour, Diggory, and then the goblet flared again. Not blue-white but deep gold, old magic gold, the color of something deciding for itself. 2 slips of parchment rose together, wound in the same thread of light. Karkaroff cited tournament law. Madame Maxime reserved judgment with precision. Fudge began an objection and stopped when he remembered what 2 Wizengamot seats looked like from the wrong side of them. "The goblet is the arbitrating authority," Dumbledore said, holding both parchments. "Its decision is final." He looked at Harry when he said it, and the calculation in that look was not entirely about the tournament. "We have 4 champions. Task 1. The Hungarian Horntail, against which Harry had prepared since September with the relevant magizoological literature, including the location of the primary sensory nerve cluster behind the 3rd cervical plate that produced complete motor suppression when targeted correctly. He entered the enclosure, moved laterally to avoid the chain's natural arc, and placed the sedation charm at 32 seconds when the Horntail committed to a strike. It went down. He collected the golden egg and walked back. The crowd found its voice after nearly 2 minutes, not applause first, but the specific sound of 4,000 people simultaneously revising their expectations. Hermione stood her ground against the freshly roused Horntail and met its charge with a directional pressure strike. Combat magic developed across a decade of early mornings in a Surrey garden. Refined by 4 years of deliberate practice in the chamber, the Horntail took 3 involuntary steps backward, with the expression of something encountering genuine resistance for the first time in its considerable life, paused to reassess, and made the decision that this particular target was not worth the energy. She collected her egg, walked back. The crowd's response was a different kind of silence, not the silence of recalibration, but the silence of 4,000 people searching for a category and not finding one. Krum, in the champion's enclosure, watched Hermione's task with complete attention, and afterward said something in Bulgarian that Harry, who had learned 15 words of Bulgarian specifically to understand Krum's unrehearsed reactions, chose not to translate. He wrote it in his notebook and filed it under Primary Source Assessment, significantly positive. Task 2. The lake, solved by Harry through a runic sequence drawn in permanent ink on his own skin, replicating Gillyweed's mechanism through Elder Futhark applied to relevant anatomy, a method he had tested in a private pool in October. He recovered, Sirius, designated his hostage, with 12 minutes remaining. Hermione surfaced in 22 minutes. When judges asked how she had breathed, she said she had moved quickly. They did not press. Task 3. The maze and June navigated together until the center opened and the cup set gleaming and obviously rigged. Harry closed his hand on one handle. Hermione's hand found the other before he could take it alone. The portkey activated. The graveyard arrived the way such places do. Cold ground, old stone, the smell of earth that doesn't forget. A ritual was already running. Red-blue light, a cauldron, Wormtail moving with the urgency of someone following instructions that predated the current situation and hadn't been updated for 2 targets. Hermione cast a detection ward in 4 seconds. 8 Death Eaters on the perimeter, Wormtail at the cauldron not yet complete. Harry's forearm mark pulsed, the Horcrux shard recognizing the proximity of its source, not with pain, but with the resonance of 2 wrong things knowing each other across a graveyard in the dark. "Not complete yet," Harry said. "Seconds," she said. Wormtail moved toward Hermione. The ritual's 3rd step required an enemy's blood, and she wore the famous scar, the famous name. Harry's binding ropes launched before Wormtail covered half the distance. But in the fraction of a second before the ropes landed, Wormtail had drawn a thin line across Hermione's forearm with his knife, the smallest possible quantity, a contingency he had prepared for, and the blood fell into the cauldron. The ritual completed, Voldemort rose. The red eyes moved across the graveyard with the inventory of a mind that had been a thought for 14 years and was now a fact again. They found Hermione, held on the scar, something fractured in the expression, not the right soul, not the right configuration, not the thing that had been modeled through all those years in the dark. Then they found Harry, and stopped. The forearm mark pulsed, not warmth now, contact. The Horcrux shard recognizing its source with the resonance of two fragments of the same ruined thing, finally in the same space. "What?" Voldemort said, and for the first time in anything Harry had ever read about him, the word held genuine uncertainty. "What are you?" "Harry Potter," Harry said. "The actual one. You've been hunting the wrong person for 14 years. The calculation behind those red eyes was visible. An intelligent mind encountering a gap larger than any it had previously been required to account for, running through implications at speed, arriving at one clear destination, Dumbledore. "The shard is in you," Voldemort said. "Not in her." He looked at Hermione, then back at Harry. "And Dumbledore arranged everything," Harry said. "That conversation comes later." Voldemort raised his wand. Hermione took the Death Eaters, not as a secondary assignment, as a primary engagement, conducted with the completeness she brought to everything. Her binding web, developed in third year and refined to cover multiple targets simultaneously, took 3 in the opening seconds. 2 curses hit her shield and were redirected outward rather than absorbed. The combat principle that a shield storing incoming force is categorically more useful than one that merely blocks. 2 more Death Eaters went down from their own redirected energy, crumpling in ways that suggested they had severely underestimated both the force and the source. The remaining 3 made various decisions. She accommodated those 2. Harry faced Voldemort. He had been planning the mechanism since January of third year. Not the confrontation, the specific instrument. The Horcrux shard in his forearm was a channel, and channels operated in both directions. The Peverell grimoire, recovered from the Gringotts vault and read with the full attention he gave material requiring significant model revision, described what happened when a shard was returned to its source through love magic rather than absorbed into it. Dissolution. The shard, carrying 14 years of Lily's sacrifice protection in its immediate environment, could be sent back through the connection with that protection intact. Love magic had broken Voldemort once. It would do what it had already proven it could do. The reversal required a bonded cast. 2 magical cores joined in deliberate configuration, producing an output categorical rather than additive. The way 2 instruments playing the same frequency produce something that transcends both individually. Harry and Hermione had practiced this 312 times in the chamber since third year, under every condition they could manufacture. The other Horcruxes, located and destroyed across 3 years of systematic preparation through the chamber's archive and the Peverell grimoire, each one neutralized before this night, were gone. This was the last anchor. This was what the graveyard was for. Voldemort's killing curse crossed the dark in terrible green. The bonded cast met it, their joined output at full expression for the first time, and the curse didn't rebound or deflect. Its intentional architecture came apart. The way glass shatters at exactly the right frequency, the specific dissolution of something meeting the force it was constructed to destroy, but had not, 14 years ago, been strong enough to face alone. Harry opened the channel fully. The shard dissolved, the way a sound ends, with the completeness of an absence where a presence had been. The mark on his forearm went cold, then still, then was simply a mark, just his forearm, just scar tissue. Tom Riddle, born 1926, ended in a graveyard in the early summer of 1995. Mortal and stripped, and small, in the presence of 2 people he had spent 14 years hunting. He did not fall dramatically, he simply ceased, with the finality of a mechanism that had run out of the logic sustaining it. The remaining Death Eaters made their choices. 3 ran, 2 waited to find out what the people who had just done that wanted from them. Harry and Hermione stood in the June dark. His forearm was just his forearm. "Done," he said. "Done," she said. "You sent the Patronus when When the cauldron fired, she said. Horrors in 4 minutes. He looked at her. While fighting 8 Death Eaters. 7. I dealt with one before I sent it. A pause. The message-bearing Patronus took most of 4th year to develop. I was beginning to wonder when it would actually be useful. He opened his notebook, then he closed it, which he almost never did, and stood in the graveyard with the cold earth and the 4-minute wait, and let the moment be exactly what it was, without annotation. When the Aurors arrived, he handed them Wormtail, the 5 captured Death Eaters, and a sealed prosecution package, prepared in February, updated in May, certified by the goblins in June, containing everything needed. Then they took the portkey back. Hogwarts in June evening, grass under their feet, the castle's lights in the distance, air that wasn't a graveyard. Notebook, Hermione said, after a moment. He took it out, looked at a blank page. He wrote 1 line. It ended in a graveyard, as it started. The difference was us. He put the pen away. They walked toward the castle. Dumbledore's office on a Thursday morning in 5th year, and Harry laid the portfolio on the desk. The room had the quality of a space that knew something final was being said in it. The silver instruments were still. The portraits awake, watching without pretense. Fawkes on his perch, with the particular stillness of something that has been through many significant moments and is recognizing one. Sirius sat to Harry's left, a year and a half out of Azkaban, still carrying 12 years in the economy of his posture, but present with the full weight of a man who had been waiting for this particular room. Hermione sat to Harry's right, not quite touching his arm. Harry moved through the portfolio in the same level voice he used for material facts, the voice he had been using since he was 5, and the universe was a system with comprehensible rules, and all he needed to do was be thorough enough. The Blood Masquerade performed on 2 infants in the autumn of 1981, its magical signature matching a ward modification made to Hogwarts' foundational structure on the same night. Documented in Goblin audit records sealed in 7 vaults, 3 foreign archives, and the Goblin Sovereignty Accord's witness register. The sole verification audit, confirming that the blood heir to the houses of Potter and Peverell was Harry James Potter, currently registered as Harry Granger. The inheritance fraud violating 4 separate statutes under wizarding inheritance law. The child endangerment charges, Hermione placed as a deliberate decoy target with no support or knowledge of the danger she represented. Harry raised with an embedded Horcrux shard and no awareness of what it was or what it was doing. Sirius Black's wrongful imprisonment, the information Dumbledore had held and withheld, the Veritaserum that could have been administered and wasn't, 3 years of active deception while serving as headmaster to both children he had defrauded, and the ongoing decisions, year after year, term after term, to let it continue. He closed the portfolio. Those are the facts. The documentation is complete and beyond retrieval. You know this because you have spent 60 years being the person who understood when something passed beyond retrieval. Dumbledore looked at the portfolio, at Harry, at Hermione, who had not spoken, simply present, receiving the moment rather than managing it, with the stillness she had built over 15 years in spaces that didn't want her there. At Sirius, who held his gaze and did not look away. I will not insult you, Dumbledore said, by beginning with the greater good. No, Harry said, don't. A long silence with weight in it. I believed what I did was necessary, Dumbledore said. I believed Voldemort would return, that the shard required concealment, that the visible target needed the protection of Lily's sacrifice while the true carrier remained unknown and safe. I believed all of these things were true, which they were, and I believed that truth justified what I did to 2 children who had no say in any of it. He paused. It did not. No, Harry said. It didn't. Hermione spoke once. You put me in a cupboard under the stairs, she said, in the voice that had shed everything extraneous. McGonagall told you in the autumn of 1981 that the Dursleys were the worst kind of muggles. You knew. You placed me there anyway as a variable in your arrangement. She held his gaze. Do not call that protection. Dumbledore looked at her, not at the famous scar or the Potter name, or the mythology constructed around the child he had placed on that doorstep. At the person, at 15 years of a girl who had been in a cupboard and survived it and built something extraordinary from what had been done to her, sitting in his office with the stillness of someone who had long since stopped being fragile about any of it, and had not needed to perform fragility in order to make this moment count. I am sorry, he said. For what it is worth, I am sorry. Worth, Hermione said, is not the question. Legal standing is. Harry placed 3 documents on the desk in sequence. The petition for removal as Chief Warlock, citing documented fraud in Goblin record. The petition for removal as Headmaster, submitted through the Board of Governors, who had been formally notified the previous week in Harry's capacity as Lord Potter, holding a historical family seat on the board. And then a 3rd document, placed separately off to the side. That one is personal, Harry said. Dumbledore read it, set it down carefully, looked at his hands on the desk for a long moment. 2 weeks, Harry said. 2 weeks, Dumbledore agreed. Sirius exhaled. A long, slow breath, the kind that carries something carried for a long time. He looked around the office. The instruments, the portraits, the headmaster's chair now formally relinquished, the chair that had been the seat of the only authority in the wizarding world that had never once been checked. He looked at it for a long time. 12 years, he said, not to anyone in the room, to whatever audience 12 years in Azkaban gives you. And all it took was 2 children with notebooks and legal briefs and a snake that could negotiate on its own behalf. 3 goblin vaults, Hermione said, and a map. 3 goblin vaults and a map, Sirius agreed. He stood up. He was grinning, the grin Harry had seen in photographs, the one that didn't fit on the ministry steps because it belonged to a younger version of him that hadn't been put away properly, and was now carefully and not always comfortably coming back. James would have loved every single piece of this. They walked out into the corridor. Snape was in the corridor outside the headmaster's tower. He had been there for some time and made no effort to pretend otherwise. His eyes moved from Harry to Hermione to Sirius, with the precision of someone adding significant new data to a model being comprehensively rebuilt. Professor Snape, Harry said. He stopped. He looked at Snape with the attention he gave primary sources. Complete, unhurried, the full force of a mind that had been building a picture of this person since the first day of potions. I want you to know that I know about Lily Evans, what she meant to you, how her death has shaped the choices you've made since. Snape went absolutely still. I know because I read everything available about my own parents, including the letters she wrote to Dumbledore about you. He paused. She asked him to protect you. He said he would. He let it sit. He kept that promise, Harry said, exactly as well as he kept all of his others. He walked past. Hermione followed. Sirius followed. Behind them, Snape stood without moving. His face did something that hadn't been visible in any public space for 15 years. Something belonging to a time before the war, before the choices, before he had trained himself to believe that what he had lost was what he had deserved to lose. He thought about a red-haired girl who had believed in him when he gave her almost no good reason to. He thought about her son, who had just demonstrated a quality of knowledge and a quality of mercy she would have recognized immediately. And that Snape was only beginning, standing in a corridor outside a headmaster's office changing hands, to understand. He stood there for a long time. Minerva McGonagall became headmistress 6 weeks into 5th year. She ran Hogwarts the way it had been designed to function, as a school rather than a stage for someone else's narrative. The change was structural, expressed gradually, in the way of things reoriented at their foundation and growing differently over time. Snape incorporated Harry's potions methodology into the curriculum that autumn, presented under the institutional framing of ongoing pedagogical development, and attributed in his private correspondence with McGonagall as originating in independent research the school would benefit from formalizing. Harry received a 1-line note in November. The cold phase method works for Felix Felicis as well. Confirmed this week, unsigned. He filed it between 2 pages of Year 1 notes. Neville Longbottom, who had spent 4 years developing quietly while the school's attention was elsewhere, came into his own under McGonagall's tenure in ways that shouldn't have been a surprise but were, to most observers, genuinely revelatory. His gift for herbology had never been in question. His defense capabilities and the stubborn courage he could locate under pressure had been chronically underestimated, including by himself. He had spent years in the proximity of Harry and Hermione and learned, by observation rather than instruction, that competence was built from consistent practice in the specific things you were afraid you couldn't do. He had been practicing. When his grandmother Augusta attended the first parent day of the new administration and looked at Neville across a classroom full of his work, something in her face rearranged itself into 3 parts pride, and 1 part reckoning with how much of him had always been there, waiting for a different kind of room. Luna Lovegood arrived in 5th year with the tranquil certainty of someone who had organized her own cosmology and found it sufficient. She had read the same medieval bond theory texts in her father's archive that Harry had found in the restricted section, and she arrived at Hogwarts already aware that the resonance between Harry and Hermione was real, that its nature was not mysterious to anyone paying the right kind of attention, and that most people's failure to perceive it was primarily a limitation of their attention. She said this directly, at their first shared lunch. Hermione looked at her for a moment. "Sit down," she said. It was, Harry noted privately, exactly what Hermione had said to him on the train in 1st year, and it carried the same weight, not an invitation, but a decision, which was the most genuine form of welcome he knew. Ron Weasley had been present for most of the important moments. The chessboard sacrifice, the stone corridor, the long evenings in the common room where his honest pushback had been genuinely useful, rather than merely contrary. He was right more often than anyone who hadn't observed it closely would have predicted. His instinct for people was a rarer quality than most of what the school formally measured, and Harry had been noting this since 2nd year. He was also, Harry observed, the person most likely to notice when something was wrong before anyone named it, and to be already doing something about it when the announcement arrived. Fred and George Weasley had quietly become a secondary intelligence network, information flowing in exchange for a standing arrangement regarding potions calculations and what they called creative liability protection. They had also appeared, unasked, on the morning Sirius Black's acquittal was announced, and stood on the ministry pavement eating cauldron cakes with the satisfied air of people who had come to witness something important. The Wizengamot reforms took 18 months. The resistance was real and not always subtle, and new structures had to be built while old ones were still partly standing. But the evidence was on the table, the goblin interest was active, and Sirius held the Black family seat with the energy of someone converting 12 years of wrongful imprisonment into legislative fuel, which turned out to be considerable. He was, Harry noted privately, exactly as his father had described, someone who made rooms feel larger when he entered them, who had not lost this despite everything, and who was still, even after everything, genuinely funny. Blood Masquerade statutes were rewritten, mandatory trial provisions formalized and expanded. Muggle-born integration standards improved. Not sufficiently, Harry noted, but in the right direction, and direction mattered in work that spanned generations. He kept a running list of what was still incomplete, organized by category, updated every quarter. The list would be accurate as long as it was maintained. He intended to maintain it indefinitely. In the first Wizengamot session of a new year, Lucius Malfoy led a motion to censure Harry and Hermione for challenging established authority without proper age or standing. He delivered it with the smooth confidence of someone who had used this chamber as a venue for performed certainty for 30 years. Harry stood. He was 16. He opened the notebook. The motion charges insufficient standing. On standing, I hold the lordships of Potter and Peverell. Per goblin record filed with the Sovereignty Witness Register, Lady Potter holds Wizengamot recognized status as bearer of the blood mark of Lily Potter, formally acknowledged by this chamber in the spring of 1982. That standing has not been challenged in 15 years. He turned a page. On age, the 1803 Exceptional Standing Act provides that any individual with documented, controlled, intentional magic may exercise full legal and Wizengamot rights, irrespective of chronological age. Lady Potter's first documented instance occurred at 4 years old. Mine at 5. Both are in Goblin record, predating this motion by 2 years. He closed the notebook. The motion has no evidentiary basis. I move we proceed to the Muggle-born protection statute, tabled for 6 months. 74-12 against the censure. Lucius Malfoy sat in the Malfoy seat and watched the architecture of a 30-year position collapse in 4 minutes of notebook citations and did not speak for the remainder of the session. Sirius leaned toward Harry. Your father would have loved this. Harry looked at him. Sirius's face had the warmth that had been recovering, unevenly and not always quickly, since the day he had walked out of the ministry building and stopped on the steps to look at the sky, the face of someone learning, after a long interruption, how to be glad to be alive. Tell me more, Harry said. I'll take notes. Sirius laughed. The full version, genuine, finding its way back to its original shape. Hermione, on Harry's other side, was annotating the protection statute's second reading with a red pen. The corner of her mouth moved. That winter, in the chamber, On an evening when the reforms were in second reading, and the Horcrux legislation was in draft, and the Peverell estate documentation was half complete, and the Muggle-born integration review deadline was 3 months away, Harry descended the chamber steps with 2 conjured mugs of tea and found Hermione at the work table reading a legal text with the attention most people gave things they found beautiful. He put a mug beside her. She took it without looking up. He sat down. He opened the notebook. Outside, through the castle's stone and earth, Hogwarts was doing what it did on winter evenings. The warm particular noise of a school settling into itself. Students moving toward common rooms. The specific relief of a week survived. Neville was likely in the herbology greenhouse, which McGonagall had extended his access to in October. Luna was probably in the library, reading something whose relevance would become apparent 3 days later in a way no one could have predicted. Ron was probably in the common room, telling a story that was improving in the telling, which was a gift he had and knew how to use. Harry looked at the notebook. Years of entries, volumes 1 through 9, the accumulated record of a mind that had spent 15 years treating the world as a system to be understood, and had arrived, through that process, without intending it, at something it hadn't been looking for and hadn't known to name. He looked at Hermione. She was reading, mug in both hands, working through dense, statutory language with her full attention. Her face was the same face it had been in a train compartment in September of 1991, when she had walked in and said sit, and meant it. And it was also more than that, the same face with years of lived content behind it, the face of someone who had been in the cupboard and in the graveyard and every room in between, and had decided, through all of it, to remain exactly what she was. He thought about a text 14 centuries old. When two magics of common source are separated by art and reunited by proximity, they will seek completion as water seeks its level. He thought about the mark on his forearm, just scar tissue now, the record of something finished. He went back to his notebook. She went back to her text. The chamber held them in its quiet, built 1,000 years ago for one purpose, which had found, through a sequence of events no one planned and everyone survived, a better one. The work was real and vast and would take years. There would be resistance, reversals, days when progress felt inadequate against the scale of what remained incomplete. Harry and Hermione had calculated all of this years ago in the same room, with evidence spread across the table and tea going cold between them. They knew what it cost. They had decided it was worth it anyway, which was the only decision that mattered. They had made it without being asked, at 11 years old in a train compartment, when a frequency had resolved into its source, and two people separated by an act of monstrous good intentions had found each other across the distance and decided, with the completeness of things that are simply correct, to stay. Outside, the wizarding world continued its long adjustment, cautiously, unevenly, with the reluctance of a system discovering that its foundational certainties were wrong. It would take decades. There would be ground lost and ground regained. There would be people who preferred the old architecture, who would work systematically to restore it, and who would find, systematically, that Harry and Hermione had already anticipated this and filed accordingly. Two objects that shouldn't exist. A composition notebook, worn soft at the corners. A library card pressed flat with patient fingers. Neither of which was supposed to be there, both of which, in the end, changed everything. The Wizengamot reforms passed their final reading in the spring of Harry's 6th year. Not cleanly, nothing that size passes cleanly, but passage is passage, and the provisions that mattered most were in the text. Mandatory legal representation for any individual accused before the chamber, a 3-step verification requirement before any emergency detention, and the blood masquerade provisions that made what Dumbledore had done not just historically wrong, but explicitly, formally, undeniably illegal going forward. Harry was 17 when the vote passed. He sat in the Black family seat and watched the count, and when it was done he wrote one word in his notebook, which was the same word he had written on the day Sirius walked out of the ministry and the day Voldemort ended in a graveyard. Done. Then he turned to the next page, because the next page was full of what came after. Sirius caught up with him in the corridor outside the chamber. He put his hand on Harry's shoulder, and Harry stopped walking, and they stood there in the corridor while the other members filed past. And Sirius's grip was the grip of someone conveying something he didn't have words for, and had decided this time not to try. "James," he said very quietly, "a habit by now, not grief exactly, but the continuing presence of someone who had been gone but was not absent. a distinction Sirius had taught Harry to understand. "I know," Harry said. They walked out into the afternoon. Hermione sent a letter that evening. Not a long one. She was in the process of drafting the Muggle-born integration framework's second reading amendments and didn't have time for long, but it said what it needed to say. In the direct, precise language she used for things that mattered. The vote passed. You knew it would. So did I. The fact that we were both right doesn't make it smaller. I'll see you Thursday for the next set. She had signed it simply H, which was what she signed everything to him. He put it in the back of Volume 9, between 2 pages of graveyard notes and a pressed leaf from a northern Scottish plant whose name he had looked up and memorized. Then he opened Volume 10, turned to the first blank page, and began. It was not, he thought, so different from the first volume. The 5-year-old in Devon with a cup on the floor and a hypothesis, and no category for what he was dealing with yet. The cup had reassembled itself, and he had written it down, and that had been the beginning of understanding that the world was not fixed, that things moved, that the right kind of attention could change the shape of what was possible. He was 17. He had a notebook, a godfather, a stack of draft legislation, a snake who could negotiate on her own behalf, a goblin alliance, and a person who had walked into a train compartment at 11 years old and said sit and meant it, and who was at this moment sending him a letter that said, "I'll see you Thursday." He wrote the date at the top of the first page of Volume 10. Then he continued, "The work, as it always had been, as it always would be, was exactly what was needed, and it was enough. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end."